My name is Ralph van Doorn. I work at the World Bank. I'm a very conventional economist, but luckily I have many colleagues in my organization who are less conventional. I'm from the Netherlands, a country that has suffered, that's largely, or half of it, below sea level, and vulnerable to climate change. But also we've made out of this disadvantage quite a good case, and we are now specialized in things like water management whenever there's a problem, even in Sri Lanka. I see Dutch civil engineers who come and advise. So it is possible to make out of your disadvantage an advantage. Just to start, I mean, Sri Lanka, we believe, is endowed with very valuable natural assets and endowments. And for example, you can think about the medicinal plants, flood protection, and nature-based tourism. But typically in Sri Lanka, these assets are actually not very well managed and they're undervalued. And because of the result of this undervaluation, you see that there's strains between urbanization, infrastructure development, increased mobility and traffic, agricultural encroachment, and there's a tug of war. And because your natural assets are not valued properly, there's no value put on it, it's losing out. So your exceptional natural assets are under strain. An example, also as Mr. Chung mentioned, the natural disasters, in fact, have quite a big impact on Sri Lanka. We estimate that natural disasters cost about, in the long term, annual average, about $380 million in losses, which is about 0.5% of GDP, which by 2050 may be about 1.2% of GDP. And the floods and droughts that happened in 2016 do have an impact on the GDP growth. So we do think that not managing your natural assets well has a short-term impact, and we don't have to wait for the long term. So how does the World Bank define green growth? We think green growth is growth that's efficient in using its resources. It's clean in that it minimizes pollution and environmental impact. It's resilient in that it accounts for natural disasters and the role of environmental management and natural capital in preventing physical disasters. And it's inclusive. Now, having looked around the world in this study, it's a 2012 study on inclusive green development, if you're interested, we think green growth, in fact, is necessary, efficient, and affordable. So it can be done. But you have to deal with the obstacles, whether political, behavioral, or lack of financing instruments. And it's important to avoid getting locked into long-term unsustainable paths. So that's the theory. How does it apply to Sri Lanka? Now, if we look at Sri Lanka, we think there are benefits to adopting a more thoughtful approach to its policies and having a green lens on its policies. And specifically, we think that the benefits for Sri Lanka, and they are actually short-term benefits, not just medium to long-term benefits, reducing the vulnerability to commodity price shocks, reducing the economic, fiscal, and social impact of natural disasters, which happen, twice a year by now, reducing fiscal transfers to the state-owned utility companies. Green growth will increase the quality of life. It will ensure environmental sustainability and help you meet several of the Sustainable Development Goals and the nationally determined contributions under the COP21. But how to get there? And this is a business forum. We look at what can the public sector do itself, and in terms of incentives to the private sector to get to where it wants to be. So first of all, do no harm. In the public sector, apply a green filter to whatever policies you do. Look at harmful subsidies, try to remove them and replace them by targeted cash transfers where needed. The fertilizer subsidy is a case in point, which was abolished. You look at public investment, make sure your investment can be implemented. It's well budgeted, it accounts for long-term running costs, such as maintenance and operational costs, so that your investments are in fact sustainable. But also try to get the private sector in. The fiscal accounts of the government are constrained. There's a lot of savings in the private sector. How can they be mobilized? And there are two ways. One is crowd in the private sector. For example, the multilateral development banks, including the World Bank, have started this what we call the cascade approach, where we say, given that concessional resources are constrained, try to mobilize commercial financing first, if it can be on commercial, effective, cost-efficient terms. If that doesn't work, try to figure out what's the problem in the commercial financial market, and what are the obstacles to having a more efficient market that actually can give you the financing for infrastructure. If that doesn't work, how can you enhance credit through perhaps guarantees and other ways to take the risk out of private investments? And if that doesn't work, you use concessional financing, public finance. So it's important to get the public sector in. The private sector. The second way is how can you actually get the private sector to also adopt green policies itself? And that's a key problem in Sri Lanka, is the business climate and access to finance. It's, as you probably have learned, 2.5 weeks ago, the government launched an investment climate roadmap to improve the investment climate for especially small and medium enterprises. And this is very important because they're the ones who have very difficult access to finance, and they are the ones who need to invest in green technologies, perhaps become more innovative, maybe even become market leader in what they do, so that the private sector can also be encouraged to go into the direction. There's also a Secure Transactions Act, which is probably about to be submitted to Parliament, which will help small and medium enterprises get better access to finance on reasonable terms. Now, what kind of policies can the government look at? Well, let's look at those 3 sets of policies. Green urban development. So developing megapolis is a good thing, but it's also an opportunity where you have to avoid locking yourself into long-term unsustainable paths. If you look at the example, say, Los Angeles, which was designed for the car, that's not where you want to go to. You want to design megapolis in a way that it has already all the public transport facilities and also provide access to the public facilities to encourage inclusion. If you look at disaster risk management, how can you mitigate the impact of disasters? There has to be a disaster risk financing strategy, maybe a disaster reserve fund to make sure that the budget has a fast disbursement mechanism in response to natural disasters, and also link social protection to disasters so you can immediately help those who are the poorest. If you look at carbon pricing, and that's the last big policy topic, we take note of a government that has approved the new long-term energy generation strategy, which seems to be moving away from coal into renewables. Now, why did they do so? Well, as far as we understand from the media, it's because they got the pricing right. They looked at negative externalities of coal. They looked at the proper long-term pricing of coal and other energy sources, and they realized that in the long term, it's more efficient to switch to renewable energy. So that's one example of how green growth can be affordable by looking at the right prices and taking into account the negative externalities. But you can go further. You can think about, okay, the fuel prices are fixed. There's no discouragement of energy consumption because fuel prices are administered. So if you let the market determine the fuel price, what impact would it have? It would reduce energy imports, it would reduce energy consumption, it would reduce fiscal transfers to the state-owned utilities. It would also impact the poor, but from the fiscal savings you have by letting the state-owned utilities make a reasonable margin, you can actually, from the fiscal saving, you can compensate the poor households and the vulnerable households to make sure that they don't get hit by commodity price shocks. You can go one step further. You currently have petrol excise, diesel excise, but these are not aimed at targeting the highest polluting gases. They are mainly revenue earners, as we know. So if you adopt a proper carbon tax that really taxes the highest polluting gases, then you can actually change people's behavior and firms' behavior in adopting less polluting technologies. So in conclusion, from our perspective, we think green growth has many benefits for Sri Lanka. They're necessary, efficient, and affordable, as long as you can overcome the political, behavioral, and financial obstacles. Thank you very much.